All right, class, today we are going to talk about two-dimensional arrays. We're going to take that one-dimensional string of information, or I shouldn't say string because that is another data type, but we're going to take that one-dimensional piece of data, the array, and turn it into two-dimensional grids. Let's take a look at what this looks like in code. But before we do the code, let's talk about what the data looks like and some things that we need to think about that are a little bit different than how you may have dealt with grids and arrays in your math class. Now, typically in math class, we have something like this. When we're dealing with two-dimensional numbers, we're dealing with an x and a y coordinate. And when we write our coordinates, we're writing x comma y, right? So we go 2 comma 3. And that would mean 0, 1, 2, and 0, 1, 2, 3, right? And it would be some point up here. That's how we would do it in our math class. This is math. But we don't do this in our computer science. We do things a little bit differently. So we don't do this. This is not how we do our two-dimensional arrays. Instead, when we're looking at two-dimensional arrays, we're going to be looking at from the top, well, I guess it'll be your top right-hand corner down. So we start here, 0, 0. And we move first down the rows and across the columns. So this is columns, and this is rows. So we always move rows, then columns. So if I have a position let's say 2 comma 3, I'm going to count 0, right? Our 0th row, our first column, second column, or second row rather, and then come over 0, 1, 2, and 3, and this would be my location here within the data. So this is what it looks like, rows and then columns, and we can fill this with data just like we did with standard arrays, and many of the same rules apply with two-dimensional arrays as they do with one-dimensional arrays. So we still can only hold one piece of data or one data type at a time, and we still move through it in a similar way. A good way to think about 2D arrays is 2D arrays are arrays of arrays. So this is how they actually work within Java memory. So remember that arrays can hold a data type, and they can hold object data types, and arrays themselves are object data types. So the way that a 2D array works is we actually have a single array that keeps track of our rows, and each one of these locations is in fact a reference to another array that keeps track of the columns. So one array is holding an array type that happens to hold the other arrays of information. Okay, so let's look at this now in the code that we have this background on it. So let's say I want to create a 2D array of integers. A 2D array of integers would look like this. Int, 1 bracket, and the most complicated part, we put a second bracket. And we call this, we could call this anything. We can call this R, right? We can give it a variable name just as we do with anything else. And now we can declare it in multiple different ways. We can do new int array. Oops, I want to do this. And now, just as I did before, I can decide on the number of rows and columns I want. And it always goes rows and columns. So this is rows, and this is columns. Rows and columns. Rows, columns. Rows, columns. Every single time. Row, column. And in fact, when we loop through these, the best way to do it is to write out row and column so you don't confuse yourself, and you don't confuse the AP grader so that they know exactly what you are intending to do as you loop through this. So I highly suggest, as you practice looping through these, use your variable names in your for loops as row and column so that you are clear on where you're moving through the 2D array, and also for the AP grader, you're clear on what is happening in your algorithm. Okay, so this is how we can declare it in one way. Another way that we can declare this is using the curly braces shortcut. So let's say we create another int array, and let's fill it with some data this time. And we'll call this data. That's fine. And we'll give it another set. So we are used to being able to use these curly braces to fill an array when we initialize it. But as I said, this is an array of arrays. So inside of my array, I'm going to initially put another set of curly braces, and I'll fill that with data. So let's say this is 3, 2, 1, and then I close it. So I've got 3 columns, 1 row so far. So this represents a row, right? This is my row, and each one of these is a column. So each one of these values is a column. And now I can add another row. And I can call the, let's say, 6, 5, 4. And we've just added another row, same column numbers. And let's add one more row, 9, 8, 7. And then we close out the outer curly braces to close out the double 2D array here. So if we think of this in a grid format, what would this data look like? Well, this data would look like this. So our data would be represented by a grid like this. And it would go 3, 2, 1, 6, 5, 4, and 9, 8, 7. So how do I access a piece of data? Let's say I want to access the value 4. How do I access the value 4? Well, I'm going to figure out what its row and column number is and use the similar notation that we did in standard arrays. So if we notate these, our rows are 0, 1, and 2. This is our row. And our column is 0, 1, and 2. This is column. So if I want to access the value of 4 here, I'm going to go to data, and I'm going to first put in the row. Remember, this is row. And my row value is 1, so I'm going to have 1 in here. And I'm going to look for my column value, which is 2. This is my column. And this will get me the value of 4. That will grab the value at 4. So row and column, row and column. Now we can think about the 2D array just like we do with a standard array, in that we can use for loops. Now here's the fun part about the for loops, is that the for loops we can grab an array of integers as our data type when we get to enhanced for loops. So a standard for loop, let's run through this real quick. We're going to do a standard for loop. If I drop my stylus there, we're going to use a standard for loop. And we're going to int row. Remember, we always go rows and columns. Rows and columns. That's always how we do it. We're going to do int row equals 0. We're going to start at the 0th row. And then we are going to say our row is less than, now this is where things get interesting. Remember, it's an array of arrays. So our first array, our data array, is the array of arrays. So it's going to hold the number of rows. So we say it's less than data.length. Right? So data.length. This is going to change in just a moment. And we say row plus plus. Semicolon, and then we open our curly brace. Okay, so now we are inside of our data set. Okay, so now what we want to do is we're in the rows, we now want to move across the columns. So we need another for loop to move across the columns. So I'm sorry, I didn't use blue for my int up there. This is a column equal to 0. Now this is where things change a little bit. Now we're going to say column is less than each of our row arrays width or length. So we're going to say data at that row value. So that array, this array, because remember this represents an array itself. Data at row represents an array. Dot length. Column plus plus. Now we're going to be looping through every single item in this 2D array. So now I could do something like system.out.println of data at, remember, it's going to be row and column. And since I have named my variables in my for loops row and column, it's really clear row and column. This is why I encourage you to use this, even though, yes, it's a few more characters than using I or J or some other variable names. ROW and COL will be really clear in what you're doing for your thinking and for being clear to those AP graders. We close out these for loops, and now we're printing out everything in the 2D array. Now we could get a little bit fancier and maybe use a simple print here and then a println so that it prints out as a grid. I'll leave you to think about how to do that. Let's talk about really quick the enhanced for loop and some changes we need to make in the way that we use the enhanced for loop. Hint, it's about that array of arrays. So let's loop through that data again. And now our change is not going to happen on the inner for loop, it's going to happen on the outer for loop. So in the outer for loop, the enhanced for loop, we're going to be grabbing a different data type. And that different data type is that we're now grabbing an array of arrays. Let me make my handwriting just a little bit more clear. So now we're grabbing our integer array type as the enhanced for loop data type, and we'll call this row. And now we can grab that from data. So we're going to grab each row from the data. And then we're going to have another enhanced for loop. Let me make sure that this is clear. You can see the full colon there. We're going to have another for loop. And now we can pull individual integers out of each row. So now we can pull an integer. We can call that column from row. Because remember, row is an array of integers. And now we can do our system.out.println of column. Right? Because column is the value. And there we go. That's how we do an enhanced for loop compared to a regular for loop. Slight changes in the data In the next video, we'll talk about some algorithms and where these are actually useful in computer science. See you guys in the next one.